imagine for just a second that you are in ancient Babylonia.
Oh, wow. Okay. Setting the scene early.
Yeah, exactly. So you live in a world that's entirely governed by the Enuma Elish.
Right. The foundational myth of that culture.
Exactly. So in your mind, the universe is just this chaotic, um, blood-soaked war zone. Like, it was created because a storm god named Marduk literally slaughtered a chaotic sea dragon named Tiamat, right? He ripped her corpse in half and used her rib cage to hold up the sky.
It's incredibly violent.
It's insanely violent.
Yeah.
And you, humanity, in this worldview, you are nothing but a miserable afterthought.
Yeah, you're just grunt workers.
Right. You were created from the blood of a traitorous, murdered god for one specific purpose, to do the slave labor that the lesser gods were simply, too lazy to do.
That is the cultural air you breathe every single day.
Exactly. It's a universe of violence and caprice and just utter insignificance for the human being. And then, out of nowhere, a small nomadic tribe walks into the historical record and says, actually, you're entirely wrong.
A total paradigm shift.
Yeah. They say the universe wasn't born out of a divine bloodbath. It was spoken into existence out of an ordered love. And humans, they aren't slaves. They are the absolute pinnacle of creation.
I mean, it is the ultimate piece of ancient ideological warfare.
Yes.
It's this profound subversion of literally everything the ancient Near East believed about reality.
Which is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a towering stack of sources today.
A very heavy stack.
Oh, for sure. We've got Chris R. Velasquez's extensive survey of Genesis, alongside these really rigorous academic insights from the Encyclopedia Britannica, Bible Odyssey, and various archaeological archives.
And our mission for this deep dive is to basically extract the core engine of the Bible's foundational narrative.
Exactly. We are taking apart the book of Genesis. And I want to set the stage for you, the listener, right away. Because if you know anything about what we do here, you know we aren't just going to sit here and memorize ancient genealogies.
No, definitely not.
Or, walk through a sterile table of contents. We are here to understand how this specific text constructed an entire worldview.
Because it's a narrative that moves from these cosmic, mind-bending, universal beginnings all the way down to the gritty, highly intimate, and frankly scandalous details of one single family.
A family just trying to survive the ancient world.
Exactly. And it's a text that has fundamentally shaped Western civilization.
Oh, absolutely.
Primarily because it attempts to answer the most terrifying human questions, like, why is the world the way it is? Why is humanity so deeply estranged from its creator and from each other?
Yeah, the big existential stuff.
And perhaps most pressingly for the ancient audience, how can a divine promise possibly survive the sheer weight of human dysfunction?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? So whether you are just brushing up on your ancient history or exploring the intricacies of theology, or, maybe you're just insanely curious about how ancient literature functions, we're going to unpack the DNA of this text for you.
And to do that, we really have to start by looking at the blueprints.
Right, because you can't appreciate a house until you see the architecture.
Precisely.
So looking at the macro structure of Genesis, it is decisively, almost violently, split into two major halves.
It is. The dividing line is right at the end of chapter 11.
Okay, so Genesis 1 through 11.
Right. Scholars categorize that section as the primeval history. So this covers the creation of the cosmos, the fall of humanity in Eden, the global catastrophe of the flood, and the fracturing of human empire at the Tower of Babel.
So it's all very big picture.
Very. It deals exclusively with universal themes. It encompasses the entire cosmos and the whole human race.
But without any warning, really.
Exactly, without warning. Chapter 12 shifts to the patriarchal history, which runs all the way through chapter 50.
And this second half focuses almost exclusively on, 4 generations of one specific, deeply flawed lineage.
Yes. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
I've always thought of the canonical movement of this book as this massive funnel.
Oh, that's a good way to picture it.
Like, it starts with wide, sweeping drone shots of the entire galaxy. You've got universal judgment, global catastrophes, humanity expanding and rebelling.
The wide lens.
And then suddenly, the camera just zooms all the way down into a single, chaotic family living room in the ancient Near East.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why is this highly specific funnel structure so vital for the rest of the Bible? I mean, why couldn't the text just stay cosmic and philosophical.
Well, because Genesis acts as the theological prologue to the book of Exodus and really the entirety of the biblical text that follows it.
So it's the anchor.
Exactly. If that funnel doesn't exist, the rest of the narrative just collapses.
How so?
Well, imagine just starting your reading at Exodus chapter 1.
Okay, so you just open book there.
Right. You'd find this massive nation called Israel. They're enslaved under a paranoid pharaoh in Egypt, and they're crying out to a god named Yahweh.
You would have zero context.
None. You would have no idea who these people are, how they got to Egypt, or why this specific deity has any obligation to listen to them. That makes total sense. So the funnel, from the universal human collapse down to the particular family of Abraham, it provides that foundational theological concept of election.
Yes.
The idea that God chose one family, not as an end in themselves, but as a vehicle.
Precisely. And the text goes out of its way to show that Abraham's family wasn't chosen because they were uniquely righteous or, powerful.
Far from it.
Right. They were chosen to be the mechanism through which the cosmic fracture of Genesis 1 through 11 would eventually be repaired. So the movement into Egypt, the later Old Testament concepts of covenant law, and even New Testament ideas like the Apostle Paul's entire doctrine of justification by faith in the book of Romans, none of it has an anchor without the structure of Genesis.
Okay, so now, when we talk about how this structure was actually built, our sources, particularly the academic archives and the Encyclopedia Britannica, they bring up the documentary hypothesis.
Oh, yes. JEPD.
Right, the idea that Genesis isn't just a single document written by one guy in one sitting, but a highly complex composite work.
Yeah, this stems from 19th century German scholarship, primarily a guy named Julius Wellhausen.
Right, so the theory suggests that the text we have today was stitched together over centuries from different source traditions.
Exactly. So you have the J, or Yahwist source.
And that one uses the divine name Yahweh, right?
Yes, and it features a very earthy, anthropomorphic god, a god who physically walks in gardens and closes ark doors. It seems centered in the southern kingdom of Judah.
Okay, and then the E source.
The E, or Elohist source, prefers the name Elohim. It portrays God as more distant, speaking through dreams and angels, and it centers on northern tribal traditions.
And then there's the P source.
Right, the priestly source. That one is obsessed with order, genealogies, dates, liturgy, and the Sabbath.
I've always struggled with this theory a bit.
In what way?
Well, if we accept that this text is just a composite of different political and religious factions arguing with each other over centuries, doesn't that make the book of Genesis just a Frankenstein monster? Like a haphazard scrapbook of competing ancient agendas?
That was certainly the assumption for a long time in academic circles.
But things have shifted.
Yeah, they have. What modern scholarship, particularly the canonical approach championed by scholars like Brevard Childs, emphasizes, is the sheer genius of the final redaction.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, Velazquez's survey drives this point home. Regardless of its compositional history, the final canonical shape presents a staggering, highly cohesive message.
So the editor knew exactly what they were doing.
Absolutely. The redactor, the final editor who wove these strands together, they weren't just copy-pasting.
Right.
They were building a unified theological argument.
Which is what, exactly?
It is an argument about a creator who relentlessly judges human sin, but simultaneously relentlessly advances a promise of redemption.
I love that. The seams might be visible to scholars, but the garment itself is entirely whole.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Okay, so to understand the events taking place in that one specific ancient family, we really have to step outside and look at the cultural neighborhood they lived in.
Because Genesis wasn't composed in a vacuum.
Exactly. It was born into a highly specific, very chaotic, ancient Near Eastern environment. And this circles back to the Enuma Elish myth we opened with.
Yeah, it was a world of powerful city-states, emerging empires, regional kings, and heavy caravan routes.
A lot of traffic, a lot of trade.
But far more importantly, it was a deeply, aggressively polytheistic world. The cultural air they breathed was just filled with warring, capricious, geographically bound gods.
Right. So the world behind Genesis is completely polytheistic, yet Genesis presents a radically monotheistic theology.
It's quite shocking for its time.
It really is. And we see this brilliantly in how the text intentionally demotes the gods of its neighbors, like in the surrounding cultures, the sun, the moon, the sea, and the earth. They were all terrifying deities that required constant appeasement. Right?
Absolutely. They dictated your survival.
But in Genesis chapter 1, what does God do? He creates the sun and the moon on day 4.
Day 4, almost as an afterthought.
Yes. He doesn't even give them names. He just calls them the greater light and the lesser light and basically assigns them the job of keeping time.
It's a complete theological takedown.
Wait, so is the creation story essentially a giant, ancient piece of trash talk against Babylonian gods?
What's fascinating here is, yes, in a theological sense, it absolutely
I
is.
love that.
It's a demythologization of the natural world. Think about it. If the sun is just a lamp God hung in the sky to track the calendar, you don't have to sacrifice your children to it to ensure it rises tomorrow.
Man, that is an incredibly liberating idea in the ancient world.
Liberating, albeit dangerous to the established order. Furthermore, the text frequently borrows Babylonian mythological images, but fundamentally reworks them.
The most obvious example being the ancient flood traditions. I mean, if you've read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the parallels to the Genesis flood are undeniable, but the theology is just a universe apart.
They really are. So in the Gilgamesh epic, you have a character named Utnapishtim who survives a global deluge by building a boat.
So familiar.
Very. But look at the divine motivation. Why do the gods flood the earth in the Babylonian myth?
Oh, this always gets me.
Because humans are breeding too fast, making too much noise, and keeping the gods awake.
It's literally a divine noise complaint.
Yes. And during the flood, the gods lose control of the elements. The text literally says the gods were terrified of the deluge and cowered like dogs against the walls of heaven.
That's just wild.
And it gets better. When the flood ends and Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice, the gods are so starved because they haven't been receiving human food offerings that they swarm the smoke like flies.
It's pathetic. The gods are pathetic.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Genesis.
Okay.
The God of Genesis doesn't flood the earth because he has a headache. He acts out of a profound moral grief over the pervasive corruption and violence of humanity.
Right, it's a moral judgment.
And he is utterly sovereign over the chaotic waters. They do exactly what he commands. He doesn't need Noah's post-flood sacrifice to survive. He accepts it as a restored relational bond. So, the similarities in the story only serve to highlight the massive theological chasm between Israel and its neighbors.
You know, we only know about these staggering cultural contrasts because of the massive amount of archaeological evidence we pulled out of the sand.
Oh, archaeology has revolutionized our reading of Genesis.
Right, and our sources rely heavily on a list of discoveries that shed light on this. But I think we need to talk about what these discoveries actually are, because they change how we read the text.
Definitely. The most famous, of course, are the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the Judean desert in the mid-20th century.
Those are legendary.
They are. They gave us incredibly early textual witnesses to Genesis, proving the antiquity and the rigorous stability of the transmission of the text.
But when it comes to understanding the actual world of the patriarchs...
Right. For that, we have to look at discoveries like the Nusi tablets from Iraq, the Mari letters from Syria, and the Ebla archives.
Okay, let's get specific here. I don't want to just list ancient cities. What exactly do a bunch of broken tablets from Nusi tell us about a guy like Abraham?
Well, the Nusi tablets, which date back to the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, come from a Hurrian city. They give us this massive cache of ancient family law, inheritance rights, and household contracts.
Okay, so it's ancient legal code.
Yes. Let's apply this directly to a bizarre story in Genesis.
Please do.
In Genesis 16, Sarah is barren, and she takes her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gives her to Abraham to sleep with to produce an heir.
Yeah, and to a modern reader, this looks like a horrific, highly dysfunctional soap opera.
Yeah.
Like pure desperation and abuse.
Completely. But when you read the Nusi marriage contracts, you find a very specific law. It states that if a wife is barren, she is legally obligated to provide a surrogate from her servants to her husband to produce an heir.
Wait, legally obligated?
Legally obligated. Furthermore, the law dictates that the husband cannot expel the offspring of that union.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, Sarah's actions aren't just desperate jealousy.
She is complying with binding ancient Near Eastern contract law.
Exactly. And later, when Sarah gets jealous of Hagar and demands that Abraham throw Hagar and her son Ishmael out into the desert.
Abraham is deeply distressed.
Yes. Why? Not just because he loves the boy, but because Sarah is demanding he breach his legal contract.
That completely reframes the narrative. It goes from a messy soap opera to this high-stakes legal and cultural drama.
It roots the text so firmly in a real time and place.
That is fascinating. Okay, what about the Mari letters?
The Mari letters, dating to the 18th century BCE, provide a window into the diplomatic and geopolitical world.
Okay.
They show us how semi-nomadic pastoralist people, exactly like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, moved among settled urban populations.
So they weren't just wandering aimlessly.
Not at all. The letters describe the tensions over grazing rights, the negotiation of access to wells, and how these roaming tribes managed vast kinship networks.
Very practical stuff.
We even see the term Habiru, which many scholars associate with the word Hebrew, describing a class of wandering, stateless people.
Oh, that's a cool connection.
And the Ebla archives similarly reveal massive trade and administration networks that map perfectly onto the travel routes the patriarchs took.
But I want to push back or at least clarify a boundary here.
Go for it.
Because while these archives prove that the socioeconomic rules of Genesis existed, do we actually have proof of the people? Because critics will often point out that we don't have a single Egyptian record saying, Joseph was here.
Right. You are highlighting a crucial distinction, and Velazquez's survey is very clear on the limits of archaeology.
Yeah.
Archaeology confirms the broad cultural environment. It proves the customs, the laws, the migration patterns, and the geopolitical power dynamics described in Genesis perfectly fit the second millennium BCE. But archaeology rarely verifies specific narrative details of private citizens. We haven't dug up a receipt with Abraham's signature on it.
Right.
It proves the stage existed, and it was perfectly set, but it does not provide photographs of the actors.
Which means we have to judge the actors by the rules of their specific stage. Since their religion and their legal contracts were drastically different from ours, it stands to reason their daily social lives were even more foreign.
Immensely foreign.
And this is where so many modern readers trip up. We read Genesis through the lens of a 21st century Western democracy, and we end up morally outraged by almost every chapter.
Right. If you try to referee a game of ancient Near Eastern survival using the rules of modern individualistic ethics, you are going to be blowing the whistle on every single play.
Seriously.
The text reflects a society that is radically household-centered. Identity was not individualistic. It was fiercely ancestor-based.
So everything revolved around kinship obligations, maintaining the tribal line, and inheritance struggles. Let's talk about the firstborn. The concept of the birthright and the firstborn's double portion just drives so much of the plot.
It's central, because land and wealth weren't just real estate to be liquidated, they were covenant inheritance. Your land was your identity in the cosmos.
Right. And the social dynamics securing that inheritance were incredibly intense. The sources point out that this was an honor-shame culture.
Yes. In the modern West, we largely operate on an innocence-guilt spectrum. If you break a rule, you are guilty, regardless of who knows about it.
Right.
But in an honor-shame society, the primary currency is social perception, reputation, and avoiding public humiliation.
So, like Abraham lying about his wife Sarah to Pharaoh, or the fierce, almost cutthroat rivalry between Jacob's wives Leah and Rachel over producing sons, these are all driven by the terrifying prospect of being shamed and erased from the cultural memory.
Exactly. And we also see social institutions that make us deeply uncomfortable today, like arranged marriages, concubinage, and slavery.
Let's talk about slavery, because Bible Odyssey makes a critical, necessary distinction here. We naturally associate the word slavery with the horrific chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade, the total reduction of a human being to property based on race.
Right. And the servitude we see in this specific ancient Near Eastern context of the patriarchs functioned differently.
How so?
It was largely a system of domestic labor and debt relief. In a world without bankruptcy laws or government welfare, if a family was starving or fell into unpayable debt, their only recourse for survival was to bind themselves to a wealthy household.
So it was brutal, but it was an economic safety net in a way.
Yes. It was a harsh, unforgiving world, and we must avoid what scholars call a flattening anachronism, judging ancient economic survival mechanisms solely by post-Enlightenment human rights standards.
Which brings us to perhaps the most surprising element of this ancient social structure.
Yeah.
The women of Genesis.
Yes.
Because in a world that is so heavily, undeniably patriarchal, you would expect the women to be silent, passive background characters.
But they are anything but. This is a remarkable tension in the text. It was a strongly male-dominated public order. Men held the formal legal power. Women had far less control over marital arrangements, which were primarily economic treaties between families. Polygamy was a reality.
Right. The system was entirely stacked against them.
Yet, despite that rigid, oppressive social framework, Genesis grants immense subversive narrative agency to women.
I want to spend time on this because it's brilliant. Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, Tamar. They are the ones actively driving the plot forward when the men fail.
They absolutely are. Let's look at Rebecca.
Okay.
Her husband Isaac is old, blind, and determined to give the covenant blessing to his eldest son Esau. He's completely ignoring the oracle God gave Rebecca that the younger son Jacob would rule.
So Isaac is just operating on blind traditionalism and favoritism.
Right. So what does Rebecca do? She masterminds a massive deception.
She goes on.
She dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes, cooks Esau's favorite meal, and tricks the patriarch into conferring the blessing on the right son.
She essentially hijacks the patriarchal system from within to ensure the divine promise doesn't derail.
Precisely.
And then there is Genesis 38, the story of Judah and Tamar. If we want an aha moment about ancient honor, shame, and female agency, this is it.
This is a crucial chapter.
Listeners who know the broad strokes of Genesis often completely forget this chapter. So Judah's eldest son marries Tamar, but he dies, leaving her a childless widow.
Right. And under the law of levirate marriage, which we later see codified in Deuteronomy, Judah is obligated to give his second son to Tamar to produce an heir for the dead brother.
Okay, to ensure the brother's name and property rights survive.
Exactly. But the second son refuses to perform his duty, and he dies. Judah then promises his third youngest son to Tamar once he grows up.
But Judah's terrified, right?
Yeah.
He thinks Tamar is cursed.
Yeah, so he reneges on the promise. He leaves her languishing in her father's house. And in that culture, a childless widow without a husband's household protecting her was socially and economically invisible.
She was facing destitution.
Total destitution.
So Tamar takes incredibly drastic, scandalous action. She strips off her widow's garments, disguises herself as a veiled prostitute, and sits at a crossroads where she knows her father-in-law Judah will be passing by.
It's incredibly risky.
Judah, not recognizing her, propositions her. She agrees, but she demands a pledge. His signet ring, his cord, and his staff. Basically, his ancient ID cards.
The ultimate collateral.
Right. So he sleeps with her, she gets pregnant, and disappears.
And then 3 months later, word reaches Judah that his daughter-in-law has played the whore and is pregnant.
And Judah, acting as the self-righteous patriarch, immediately orders her to be dragged out and burned to death to cleanse the family's honor.
But as she's being dragged out to the fire,
She sends the signet ring, the cord, and the staff to Judah with a message. I am pregnant by the man who owns these.
boom. It is a stunning reversal. Judah's hypocrisy is entirely exposed. And look at his response in the text.
Yeah.
He looks at his ID and he declares publicly, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shiloh."
Now, a modern reader thinks, righteous. She disguised herself as a prostitute.
But in the ancient Near East, righteousness wasn't primarily about sexual puritanism. It was about fulfilling your covenant obligations. Judah had failed his familial obligation. Tamar, at immense personal risk, forced the fulfillment of that obligation to preserve the family line. She outmaneuvered the patriarch.
She is strategic, bold, and ultimately enshrined in the genealogy of King David and Jesus of Nazareth.
It's an incredible narrative.
So we have this messy, honor-driven family drama playing out. But the way this story is recorded isn't just a haphazard diary. It's highly structured, brilliant literary art. And we need to look at the literary engine underneath the hood.
Yes, Genesis relies on very specific, repeated formulas to structure time and narrative.
What's the main one?
The most prominent is the Toledot framework. The Hebrew word translates to generations or descendants. Throughout the book, you will find the phrase, "These are the generations of."
It acts as a structural hinge, right?
Yeah.
Dividing the massive book into distinct, manageable sections.
Exactly.
I love the analogy of a quilt. Like, if all these individual stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patches, the Toledot genealogies are the thick stitching holding them all together.
That's a great visual.
If you pull the stitching out, the stories disconnect from the timeline, stretching all the way back to the creation of the cosmos.
Exactly. It roots the family drama firmly in cosmic history. And beyond the structural hinges, the literary art features heavy use of dreams, which function as providential foreshadowing.
Think of Jacob's ladder or Pharaoh's cows.
Right. It also uses repeated descent and ascent motifs. Notice how often the patriarchs are forced to go down into Egypt because of famine, face a crisis, and then come back up out of Egypt with wealth.
Oh, it is constantly foreshadowing the grand exodus that is to come.
Constantly.
And there's also this massive recurring theme of the younger overthrowing the older.
The younger over older reversal is a deliberate subversion of ancient expectations. In their world, the firstborn always inherits the power and the double portion. Yet God consistently bypasses the cultural norm.
Okay, let's track that.
He accepts Abel's offering over Cain's. He chooses Isaac over the older Ishmael. He chooses Jacob over the older Esau. Joseph rises above his older brothers. Even Joseph's younger son, Ephraim, gets the primary blessing over Manasseh.
It's everywhere.
The text is aggressively teaching that divine election is not bound by human social hierarchies.
But let's talk about the structure of specific stories, because our sources highlight the flood narrative as the pinnacle of literary art in Genesis. They note it's organized as a chiasm. Explain what that mechanism actually is.
A chiasm is a symmetrical literary pattern.
Okay.
Imagine a staircase. You walk up the steps, you reach a landing, and then you walk back down, with each step down perfectly mirroring the step you took to get up, A, B, C, D, B, A.
Right.
The entire structure is designed to point the reader's focus to the landing, the center point. In the flood narrative, the text is perfectly mirrored.
How exact is it? Like
Where?
word for word?
It's remarkably precise. Step A, God resolves to destroy the earth. Step B, Noah builds the ark. Step C, God commands them to enter the ark. Step D, the floodwaters rise and cover the mountains.
Okay, so we're going up the stairs.
Then we hit the absolute center of the text, the landing, which is Genesis 8.1. But God remembered Noah.
Wow.
From there, the narrative descends in reverse. Step D, the waters recede. Step C, God commands them to exit the ark. Step B, Noah builds an altar. Step A, God resolves never to destroy the earth again.
That is wild.
The structure forces you to see that the sheer volume of water isn't the point. Divine remembrance and covenant restoration are the whole point of the story.
No, I have to be the skeptic here for a second.
Always.
Is it possible scholars are overthinking the chiasm thing? Are we just finding patterns in the clouds? Because I find it really hard to believe that an ancient writer dealing with sheep and famine sat down with a structural schematic to make sure the word count mirrored perfectly on both sides of a papyrus.
You know, it's a very common, very fair modern skepticism, but this is where we have to fundamentally shift our perspective.
Okay.
We live in a heavily literate, text-based society. If we forget something, we Google it. We have search functions and digital archives. Ancient Israel was primarily an oral culture.
Right, they heard it.
They heard these stories spoken aloud around campfires long before they read them on scrolls.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a functional technology.
This raises an important question about memory.
Yes.
In a world of oral tradition, these structural patterns, chiasms, the Toledot headings, the recurring motifs, they were the foundational memory aids.
It's practical.
Highly practical. If you are a storyteller tasked with reciting a 50-chapter epic, the symmetry tells you what comes next. If you know the waters rose and God remembered Noah, the chiasm dictates that the next plot point must be the waters receding.
They weren't just showing off their literary finesse.
No, they were building mnemonic devices so the community could memorize and transmit massive blocks of narrative across generations without losing the core theology.
Which fundamentally changes how we view the genre of this text.
Yeah.
Like we read silently, alone, and if a story seems fanciful, we just dismiss it as myth. But for the ancient Israelites, this wasn't fiction.
No.
It was sacred history. It was identity-shaping story. It told them who they were, whose they were, and why they had any right to exist in a hostile world.
The literary brilliance was entirely in service of their survival and their identity.
Okay, now that we understand the architectural blueprints, the cultural neighborhood, and the literary engine of how the story is told, let's actually trace the narrative arc. I want to look at the macro-level collapse of humanity in those first 11 chapters. Let's start with the cosmic beginnings.
It opens with Genesis 1 and 2, which are entirely focused on creation and vocation. God speaks the cosmos into existence, and it is ordered, purposeful goodness.
It is aesthetically and morally pleasing.
And then we get to humanity. Humanity is made as image bearers. The Hebrew word is Tselem.
Tselem. Okay, explain that context.
Well, in the ancient Near East, the Tselem, the image of the god, was either a physical idol placed in a temple, or it was the king himself. The king was the sole representative of the divine.
But Genesis democratizes it.
Completely. Genesis says that every human being, male and female, is the Tselem of God. This grants universal intrinsic dignity to humanity and assigns them a representative rule over creation. They are placed in the garden to cultivate it.
Right, and furthermore, Genesis 2 institutes marriage, showing that humanity is not meant for isolation, but for covenant fellowship and companionship.
The stage is set for a flourishing partnership between God, humanity, and the earth.
Everything is pristine. But then we hit Genesis 3, the fall. And what always strikes me is the sheer, terrifying speed of the collapse.
It is incredibly fast.
The fall doesn't start with a massive rebellion or an army. It starts with a simple, almost casual conversation with a serpent. And the serpent doesn't force Eve to eat anything. He simply introduces a hermeneutic of suspicion.
Did God really say?
Exactly. He distorts the truth, implying that God is holding out on them, that God is a tyrant keeping them from true enlightenment. They grasp for moral autonomy, they eat the fruit, and the fracture occurs.
And the immediate result is alienation. They hide from God, and they turn on each other. Adam blames Eve and implicitly blames God. The woman you gave me. Eve blames the serpent.
That relational fracture metastasizes instantly.
It really does, because by chapter 4, the first human born outside the garden, Cain, becomes a murderer. He kills his brother Abel over failed worship and envy. God warns Cain, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it.
But Cain succumbs.
He succumbs.
And from there, the violence just spirals out of control. We see the development of human culture music, metallurgy, the building of cities, but it all develops under the dark shadow of human vengeance.
Yeah, we get Lamech's terrifying Song of the Sword in chapter 4.
I have killed a man for wounding me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. It is the complete glorification of disproportionate violence.
And by the time we reach chapters 6 through 9, the global corruption is so pervasive that God grieves that he even made humanity. The flood is a severe decreation.
It is the undoing of Genesis 1.
The chaotic waters that God separated are allowed to collapse back in on the world. The theological argument Genesis is making is profound. Sin is always relational before it is social.
It starts with a fracture in the trust between God and humanity, but it inevitably bleeds out into total societal collapse.
But even in the absolute devastation of the flood, there is this thread of hope. The text says Noah finds favor, and the Hebrew word used there is hen, which translates to grace.
Grace.
The text makes it explicitly clear that Noah's salvation isn't just because he was a really handy boat builder. It's grounded in divine grace. God preserves a remnant, and after the flood, he renews the covenant with Noah.
He repeats the command of Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
But the fundamental problem hasn't been solved. Humanity's heart is still bent toward autonomy, which leads us to the culmination of the primeval history, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel.
Okay, so humanity migrates to a plain in Shinar, and instead of filling the earth as commanded, they decide to consolidate. They decide to build a massive city and a tower with its top in the heavens to make a name for themselves.
Right.
And God steps in, confuses their languages, and scatters them. Why is God so threatened by a brick tower?
Well, God isn't threatened, he is intervening. Babel serves as a theological anti-pattern. This tower is a ziggurat, an artificial mountain common in Mesopotamia, designed to bridge heaven and earth so humans could manipulate the gods.
Okay, so it's about control.
Exactly. Babel represents human pride, technological hubris, and the desire to build a monolithic empire that usurps divine authority. The confusion of languages is a judgment, absolutely, but it is also a severe mercy.
Wait, a mercy? How is scattering them a mercy?
Because it prevents humanity from unifying in total, unmitigated rebellion. An absolute, unified human empire built on pride and self-worship would be a totalitarian nightmare. The dispersion forces them to obey the command to fill the earth, and it limits the scope of human tyranny.
Wow. Okay, so humanity has failed on a global scale 3 times over.
Yeah.
Eden failed. The pre-flood world failed. The post-flood unified empire of Babel failed.
Global disaster.
So God looks at this global disaster and essentially changes strategies. Instead of another cosmic flood, the focus narrows intensely. This is the shift to Genesis 12 through 50, the messy family of promise.
And Messi doesn't even begin to cover it. In chapter 12, God calls Abram, later Abraham, out of Ur of the Chaldeans.
Right.
It is an act of sovereign grace. Abraham was a polytheist moon worshiper. God gives him 3 monumental promises: land, a seed or offspring, the Hebrew is zerah, and a blessing that will eventually extend to all the families of the earth.
So the cosmic repair will come through this specific family.
Yes, but immediately Abraham's faith is subjected to a crucible of delay.
He is promised a son, but he and his wife Sarah are ancient, and they wait decades, and they stumble constantly. I mean, Abraham lies about Sarah to foreign kings out of sheer cowardice.
They try the human shortcut with Hagar, creating immense collateral damage.
Right. But God remains fiercely faithful to the promise, eventually bringing Isaac miraculously in their old age. And then comes the ultimate, agonizing test in Genesis 22. the binding of Isaac.
God asks Abraham to sacrifice the very son of the promise.
It is a harrowing narrative that pushes Abraham's faith to the absolute brink, ending with God providing a ram caught in the thicket.
A profound foreshadowing of the concept of substitutionary sacrifice. God will provide the lamb.
The promise then passes to Isaac, and from Isaac to Jacob. And Jacob, frankly, is a piece of work.
Oh, Jacob is something else.
The promise continues, but it is dragged through intense rivalry, manipulation, and deceit. Jacob cons his starving older brother Esau out of the birthright for a bowl of red stew. Then he partners with his mother to trick his blind father into giving him the patriarchal blessing. He's forced to flee for his life.
Jacob is the quintessential grasper. He comes out of the womb grabbing his brother's heel. He spends his entire life trying to control his destiny and secure his safety through clever manipulation.
But his turning point, the psychological and theological climax of his life, comes in Genesis 32.
He is about to face Esau again after 20 years, and he is terrified Esau is going to slaughter his family. Alone in the dark by the river Jabbok, he is attacked by a mysterious divine figure, and they wrestle until dawn.
It's such a visceral scene. God doesn't just speak to him, God wrestles him in the dirt.
And during the struggle, God touches Jacob's hip socket and permanently dislocates it. Jacob is crippled, yet he clings to the figure and demands a blessing.
And God gives him a new name?
Yes, Israel, which means he wrestles with God. Jacob transforms from a grasping deceiver who relies on his wits to a blessed patriarch who relies on God, walking with a permanent limp as a reminder of his encounter.
And from Israel comes the 12 tribes, leading us to the narrative climax of the entire book, the Joseph cycle, chapters 37 to 50. I want to skip the Sunday school summary of the colorful coat and look at the psychology here.
Good call.
Joseph is the favorite son of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. Jacob's blatant favoritism ruins the sibling dynamic so thoroughly that Joseph's brothers are consumed by a murderous jealousy. They throw him in a pit, debate killing him, and ultimately traffic their own flesh and blood into Egyptian slavery.
It's horrific, yet through a staggering series of providential events, enduring false accusations by Potiphar's wife, languishing in a dungeon, and interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, Joseph rises to become the vizier, second in command of all of Egypt.
Which historically aligns perfectly with the Hyksos period, where Semitic peoples actually held rulership in Egypt, making Joseph's ascent highly plausible in the geopolitical context.
Exactly. And from that seat of power, Joseph ends up managing a devastating regional famine, ultimately saving his treacherous family from starvation when they come down to Egypt seeking grain.
Which brings up a fundamental question I want to pose.
Okay.
If you are God, and you are starting a holy nation meant to bless the world and restore the cosmos, why do you choose the most dysfunctional family possible? We're talking about rampant deception, generational cowardice, blatant favoritism, and literal human trafficking within a family.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you pick people with better moral resumes?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the argument Genesis is making is that God preserves the covenant not by human merit, but entirely by divine election.
Ah, okay.
If God had chosen a morally perfect, immensely powerful family, the message to humanity would be that human righteousness and strength save the world.
That makes total sense.
By choosing a deeply flawed, wandering, treacherous family, the text screams that salvation and the fulfillment of the cosmic promise are entirely dependent on God's grace and his relentless sovereignty.
It is God working despite them, not just through them.
Precisely. And the ultimate thesis statement for this entire theology of providence comes from Joseph himself, right at the end of the book in Genesis 50.2 us.
Jacob has died. The brothers are terrified that Joseph is finally going to execute his revenge for them selling him into slavery. They fall down before him.
And Joseph utters what might be the most important sentence in the Old Testament. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive.
It is the first explicit articulation of divine compatibilism, the idea that human beings are fully responsible for their evil actions, yet God's sovereign providence is simultaneously operating over and through those actions to accomplish a redemptive purpose.
It is a masterful resolution. The brothers' evil was real, but God's providence was larger.
That idea, God working through the chaotic human mess to bring about a good creation, that is the exact redemptive spine of the whole book. And what I find incredible as we dig into the archives is that this spine is quite literally coded into the original Hebrew words used to write it. The language itself acts like an operating system for the theology.
Let's unpack the source code, because these specific Hebrew terms are the load-bearing pillars of Genesis. The very first word of the Bible is Bereshit. in the beginning.
Okay, Bereshit.
It immediately signals absolute divine initiative. Before time, before matter, God simply is and God acts. Then you have the primary verb bara, meaning create.
How does bara differ from, a human making a chair?
In the Hebrew Bible, the verb bara is strictly reserved for God. Humans can asa, they can make or fashion things out of existing materials.
So building that chair.
Exactly. But bara denotes a sovereign, effortless creative act that humans cannot replicate. It stands in stark contrast to the Babylonian gods who had to fight, bleed, and struggle to organize the world. God simply speaks, and it is.
Then there's the word tov, meaning good. God repeatedly declares his creation tav. I think we often read that as just nice or pretty,
Right.
but in the ancient context, it implies functional order. A wash is tav when it tells time perfectly. The universe is tav because it is morally, aesthetically, and functionally operating exactly as the Creator intended.
And perhaps the most critical term for understanding the rest of the biblical narrative, berit, which translates to covenant.
Barrett.
Berit is the governing category for how God relates to humanity. A covenant in the ancient world wasn't just a legal contract. It was a binding life and death relational pledge. Think of Genesis 15, where God makes the covenant with Abraham.
Oh, the cutting ceremony.
Yes, God commands Abraham to cut animals in half and lay them out. In a standard ancient suzerain vassal treaty, the lesser king would walk between the bloody pieces, essentially saying, "May I be torn apart like these animals if I break this treaty."
But in Genesis 15, Abraham falls into a deep sleep, and God alone, represented by a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, walks between the pieces.
Exactly. God takes the curse of the covenant upon himself. He says, "I will fulfill this promise, and if the covenant is broken, I will bear the cost." It is an astonishing picture of grace. We see the development of these covenants throughout the text. The creational order with Adam, the preservation covenant with Noah, and the redemptive covenant with Abraham promising land, seed, and global blessing.
So when you look at these Hebrew terms, bara, tov, selam, berit, you see the HTML code of the biblical worldview. You see how the developer built this system. Grace in Genesis isn't just a generic grandfatherly benevolence.
No, not at all.
It is an aggressive divine initiative. It is God constantly stepping into a fractured, violent world and refusing to let it destroy itself. So what does this all mean?
Genesis beautifully and intricately binds together the concept of creation making the world and covenant summoning humanity into relationship. Humanity is not merely manufactured, we are summoned. And therefore, sin is not merely breaking an arbitrary rule, it is a violent rupture of the covenantal relationship.
And for centuries, Christian interpretation has looked back at this specific source code and seen Christ-centered trajectories embedded everywhere in the text. Genesis is pregnant with anticipation.
The shadows are everywhere. You have the seed of the woman promised in Genesis 3:15, who will suffer a bruised heel but will ultimately crush the serpent's head, the first hint of a suffering conqueror. You have the substitutionary grace of the ram caught in the thicket in Genesis 22, sparing Isaac. You have the kingly blessing pronounced over Judah in Genesis 49, where Jacob prophesies that the scepter shall not depart from Judah until the one to whom it belongs arrives.
It's all there.
Genesis provides the indispensable vocabulary and framework that makes the New Testament claims about Jesus intelligible. Without the foundation of creation, fall, promise, and providence, the cross and the resurrection have no cosmic context.
Which brings everything directly back to you, the listener.
Yeah.
We have spent this hour excavating the ancient Near East, deciphering Hebrew source code, diving into ancient contract law, and tracking the staggering dysfunction of a nomadic family.
A lot of ground covered.
Why does a book about ancient pastoralists matter to your life today?
Because the core human crisis hasn't changed. We are still wrestling with the same foundational questions.
Genesis speaks directly, almost violently, to our modern debates. We live in a world that increasingly treats human beings as either biological accidents, cogs in an economic machine, or lines of data in a social media algorithm.
Utilitarianism.
Yes, your worth is constantly tied to your utility, your wealth, or your tribe. Genesis walks into that modern room and insists that human beings have absolute intrinsic dignity. Why? Because we are sullen image bearers of the divine creator. You are not an accident, and you are not a data point. Furthermore, Genesis directly challenges our modern idolatries, our blind faith in technological progress, and our constant, exhausting attempts at Babel-like empire building.
I would add that Genesis serves as a powerful antidote to modern
Oh,
cynicism.
that's a good point.
It is incredibly easy to look at the global news or look at the deep dysfunction in our own families and conclude that history is just a meaningless, chaotic grind.
A lot of people feel that way.
But Genesis argues fiercely that history is deeply meaningful. It argues that families matter, even the desperately broken ones, and that there is an ordered, purposeful trajectory to the universe, governed by a God who relentlessly keeps his promises despite our sabotage.
It is a text that simply refuses to let humanity give up hope. But as we close, I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We talked about Joseph's ultimate realization in chapter 50, that his brothers truly meant their betrayal for evil, but God meant it for good.
The ultimate paradox.
If human beings possess total moral accountability for our messy, greedy, often destructive choices, yet a sovereign divine providence guarantees that the ultimate promise of redemption will still be fulfilled, where exactly is the line between our freeware and God's final edit of the human story?
A paradox that has kept the greatest minds awake for millennia.
And a question that proves the ancient blueprints of this text are still incredibly undeniably sound. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Genesis. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember to look down at the foundation every once in a while.